The thing about extreme cold that most people misunderstand is this. It is not about how cold the air gets. It is about how fast the heat leaves your body. A man can survive in air that is 50 degrees below zero if he has adequate shelter, adequate clothing, adequate fuel. A man can die in air that is only 20 below zero if his shelter bleeds heat faster than his fire can replace it. The mathematics of winter survival are not about temperature. They are about thermal transfer, the movement of heat from warm bodies and warm spaces to the cold world outside. And the rate of that transfer determines who lives and who dies far more than the number on the thermometer. In the Dakota Territory in the winter of 1886 into 1887, the settlers in the town of Milbrook were learning this lesson in the cruelest possible way. Their wooden houses, built quickly in the first years of settlement, were bleeding heat like sieves. The walls were single-layer pine planking with inadequate chinking. The roofs were wood shingles that let wind whistle through the gaps. The floors were raised on wooden joists over crawl spaces that filled with cold air and turned the floorboards into sheets of ice that pulled warmth from any body that touched them. These houses had been adequate for ordinary winters. The winter of 1886 to 87 was not ordinary. The blizzards began in November and did not stop. The temperature dropped to 40 below in December and stayed there. The wind came down from Canada with nothing to slow it for 500 miles, driving snow horizontally through any gap it could find, piling drifts against buildings until the drifts reached the roof lines, finding every weakness in every structure and exploiting it with the patient malice of a force that had been killing humans since the ice ages and had learned exactly how to do it. The wooden houses of Milbrook consumed firewood at rates that no one had anticipated. A family that had stockpiled what they thought was a winter's worth of fuel found themselves burning through it in 6 weeks. A cast-iron stove that had kept a cabin comfortable in ordinary winters now glowed cherry red and still could not warm the room because the heat was escaping through the walls faster than the stove could produce it. The stoves were not the problem. The wood was not the problem. The houses themselves were the problem. They had been built for comfort, not survival. They had been built to look like the houses the settlers remembered from the East, with their peaked roofs and their raised floors and their straight walls rising proudly above the prairie. They had been built to demonstrate that civilization had arrived on the frontier, that the settlers were not savages living in holes in the ground, that they had brought the standards of proper American life to this empty land. Now those standards were killing them. The peaked roofs caught the wind and funneled it into the attic spaces. The raised floors created cold reservoirs beneath the living areas. The straight walls presented flat surfaces to the wind that maximized heat loss through convection. Every architectural choice that made the houses look civilized made them less capable of surviving a winter that did not care about civilization. By January, the fuel crisis had become critical. The nearest forest was 40 miles distant, and the road was buried under drifts that would not melt until April. The coal that some families had stockpiled was running low, and there was no way to get more. People began burning their furniture. People began burning their fences. People began eyeing their barns and wondering if the livestock could survive the winter without walls, while the families survived without heat. And then people began dying. The first was old Mrs. Hendricks, found frozen in her bed on the morning of January 12th, despite a fire that had been burning when she fell asleep. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, and the house had cooled so rapidly that she never woke up. The second was the Garrett infant, who died despite being held between both parents under every blanket they owned. The third and fourth were farmhands in the Peterson bunkhouse, men who had slept on the floor because there were not enough beds, and who had lost so much heat through that frozen floor that their bodies simply stopped working. The count would reach 9 before the crisis ended. 9 people dead in houses that had been built to look civilized, surrounded by fuel that had run out, frozen in structures that had been designed for a world that did not include 50 below zero. But half a mile from Milbrook, built into a south-facing hillside that everyone had said was unsuitable for a proper house, Torsten Lindqvist sat in his shirt sleeves, reading a book by the light of a small fire that had been burning low for 6 hours and would not need more fuel until evening. The temperature inside his home was 52 degrees. It had been 52 degrees in November. It would be 52 degrees in March. The temperature outside was 43 below zero. His wife Astrid was baking bread. The oven had been heated that morning with a single firing, and the residual heat in the stone walls would keep the baking temperature steady for another 4 hours. Their daughter Ingrid, 6 years old, was playing on the floor in her stockinged feet without shivering. The floor was warm, not heated by any fire, but warm with the constant temperature of the earth itself, the 55 degrees that the ground maintains at a depth of 6 feet, regardless of what the air above is doing. The Lindqvists were not cold. They were not burning furniture. They were not rationing fuel. They were living in the same comfort they had lived in since October, using perhaps 1/3 the firewood their neighbors consumed, maintaining a temperature that felt like autumn, while the world outside experienced the coldest winter in recorded history. And if you want to know how a Norwegian immigrant built a house that the entire settlement called a grave, that the general store owner said no civilized person would live in, and that turned out to be the only truly warm structure for 50 miles when the temperature dropped past the range of human tolerance, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Torsten had come to Dakota Territory in the summer of 1882, following advertisements that promised free land and opportunity to anyone willing to work. He was 29 years old, newly married to Astrid, and eager to build a life that did not depend on the fishing industry that had sustained his family in Norway for generations, but had begun to fail as the herring runs grew unpredictable and the competition from industrial trawlers made small boat fishing increasingly impossible. What the advertisements had not mentioned was that Dakota Territory had no trees, or rather, that the trees were so distant and so sparse that lumber had to be hauled 40 miles from the nearest forest at costs that tripled the price of every board. The settlers who had arrived before Torsten had solved this problem by building with whatever was available. Some had built sod houses, cutting blocks of prairie turf and stacking them like bricks to create walls that were thick and well insulated but prone to leaking, to insect infestation, and to the particular despair that comes from living inside a structure made of dirt. Others had pooled resources to purchase lumber, building the wooden houses that looked proper and American, and that would prove so inadequate when the real cold came. Torsten had looked at both options and found them wanting. The sod houses were warm but uncomfortable, their walls constantly shedding dirt, their roofs heavy with moisture that dripped onto everything below during thaws and refreezes. The wooden houses were clean and familiar, but obviously wrong for the climate, their thin walls offering no protection against cold that could freeze a man's breath before it left his mouth. He had grown up in Norway, in a region where winter lasted 8 months, and the cold could be as brutal as anything Dakota produced. The Norwegians had been building for such conditions for 1,000 years, and they had developed techniques that the American settlers had never seen. One of those techniques was the earth-sheltered house. In Norway, they were called jordkjeller, when they were root cellars, and jordhus when they were dwellings. The principle was simple. The earth maintains a constant temperature at depth, approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the air above is doing. This temperature is warm enough to prevent freezing, cool enough to prevent spoilage, and stable enough to provide a baseline that requires only minimal heating to achieve comfort. A house built into the earth shares this temperature. Its walls are not fighting against the cold air outside because they are not exposed to the cold air. They are surrounded by earth that is 55 degrees, protected by a thermal mass so large that no winter can affect it, insulated by the planet itself. The only wall that needs to resist the cold is the front wall, the one that faces outward. And if that wall is oriented to the south, it catches the winter sun, gains heat during the day, and loses far less heat at night than a freestanding structure would. Torsten had explained this to the settlers of Milbrook in the summer of 1883, when he began excavating into the hillside that everyone else had dismissed as unsuitable for building. He had described the physics of thermal mass, the way that earth temperature remains stable, the reduced fuel consumption that came from building with the land rather than on top of it. They had not understood, or rather, they had understood and rejected what they understood because it conflicted with their assumptions about what a proper house should look like. Harlan Jessup had been the most vocal in his dismissal. Jessup owned the general store, sold lumber at prices that included a healthy markup for himself, and had a financial interest in making sure that every family in Milbrook bought enough wood to build a proper American house. The Norwegians' hill house threatened that business, and Jessup responded the way threatened businessmen have always responded. He mocked it. The Norwegian is building a burrow, Jessup announced at his store one evening in August 1883, where the settlers gathered to purchase supplies and hear the news. Like a badger or a gopher. He's digging into the hillside because he cannot afford proper lumber. I suppose in Norway they live in caves. Perhaps he misses the old country. The laughter had rippled through the store. The Norwegian badger, the immigrant who was too primitive or too poor to build a real house. The mockery had a particular edge because Jessup was right about one thing. Torsten was building into the hillside partly because he could not afford enough lumber to build a freestanding house. The lumber prices that Jessup charged would have consumed most of Torsten's savings, leaving nothing for seed or livestock, or the 100 other expenses that a new homestead required. The earth-sheltered house was economical as well as practical. It required lumber only for the front wall, the door, the windows, the interior framing, and the roof beams. Everything else was stone and earth, materials that cost nothing but labor. But the economy was not the point. The point was that the earth-sheltered house was better. It was warmer in winter and cooler in summer. It required less fuel and less maintenance. It would outlast any wooden structure by centuries if properly built. The fact that it was cheaper was a bonus, not the reason. Torsten tried to explain this to anyone who would listen. Almost no one would listen. They were Americans now, or wanted to be, and Americans did not live in holes in the ground. They built proper houses with proper lumber and proper peaked roofs, and if those houses cost more and performed worse, that was the price of civilization. The construction took 2 years, partly because Torsten was also clearing land and planting crops and doing all the other work that a homestead required, and partly because the work itself was slow. The excavation was done by hand, cutting into the hillside with a pick and shovel, removing tons of earth that were piled beside the excavation to be used later for the roof. The back and side walls were lined with stone, fitted dry without mortar in the Norwegian manner, creating a barrier that would hold back the earth while allowing any moisture to drain through the gaps between stones, rather than accumulating against the interior. The front wall was timber framing, filled with a double layer of planking with sawdust packed between, providing insulation where the house faced the outside air. The roof was heavy timber beams covered with a layer of birch bark for waterproofing, then 3 feet of sod and earth that blended into the hillside above. From a distance, the house was nearly invisible. It looked like a door and 2 windows set into a hillside, with smoke rising from a chimney that emerged from natural ground. This invisibility was part of the design. A house that did not present surfaces to the wind did not lose heat to the wind. A house that was surrounded by earth did not need to be heated except in the one direction it faced. A house that was partially underground could not be buried by drifts because it was already below drift level. The first winter had vindicated everything. While the wooden houses of Milbrook struggled through an ordinary cold season, consuming firewood at rates that surprised their owners, the Lindqvist house had maintained its 52-degree baseline, with fires so small that visitors assumed the Lindqvists were out of fuel and too proud to ask for help. Astrid had laughed when she heard this rumor. "We have more fuel than we need," she had told a concerned neighbor who came to offer assistance. "We burn perhaps a cord a month. How much do you burn?" The neighbor had burned 5 cords that month. He had not returned to offer assistance. The second winter had been similar. The third winter had been similar. Each year, the Lindqvists lived in comfort while their neighbors struggled. And each year, the neighbors explained away the discrepancy with theories that avoided the obvious conclusion. The Norwegians must be used to cold. They must have thicker blood. They must not feel it the way Americans do. No one considered the possibility that the Norwegians were simply building better, because that would require admitting that Norwegian peasant techniques were superior to American progress, and admitting that was impossible. Then came the winter of 1886 to 87, and impossible became the only explanation left. The crisis arrived at the Lindqvist homestead in the form of young Thomas Jessup, the general store owner's 14-year-old son, who stumbled through the snow on January 15th with frost on his eyebrows and panic in his voice. "My mother," he gasped, barely able to speak through chattering teeth. "My father, they're dying. The house is frozen. We've burned everything. Please." Torsten did not ask questions. He pulled on his coat, harnessed his bay mare Saga to the sledge, loaded blankets and firewood, and drove the half-mile to Milbrook in conditions that should have made travel impossible. He found the Jessup house exactly as Thomas had described. The fire had gone out sometime in the night. The interior temperature was barely above freezing, despite the walls and roof that should have provided shelter. The thin wooden construction had failed completely against cold that it had never been designed to resist. Harlan Jessup lay in bed with his wife, both of them wrapped in every blanket and coat they owned, their breath coming in shallow gasps, their skin the pale gray of advanced hypothermia. They were not dead, but they were dying. Another few hours, and they would have joined the 9 who had already frozen in their civilized houses. Torsten carried them both to his sledge. He drove them back to the hillside home that Jessup had mocked for 3 years. He carried them inside, into warmth that felt like summer compared to the frozen coffin they had been living in, and he laid them beside the fire while Astrid heated broth and prepared warm blankets that had been sitting near the stove. It took 4 hours for the Jessups to stop shivering. It took 2 days for Harlan Jessup to speak. When he did, the first words out of his mouth were, "How is it so warm?" "The same way it has always been warm," Torsten replied. "The earth is 55 degrees. The house is built into the earth. The only wall that faces the cold is the front wall, and that wall is insulated and faces south to catch the winter sun. We do not fight the cold, we hide from it in the earth, where the cold cannot reach." Jessup stared at him. "The same physics I explained to you 3 years ago," Torsten continued. "The same construction you called a burrow. The same principles you said no civilized person would use. They work. They have always worked. They have worked in Norway for 1,000 years, and they work in Dakota exactly the same way. The cold does not care about civilization. It only cares about thermal mass and insulation and the direction your walls face. Your house has none of those things. My house has all of them. That is why you are alive and your house is empty." Jessup said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence was surrounding him. 52 degrees of warmth in a winter that had killed 9 people and was still trying to kill more. The evacuation began the next morning. Word spread through Milbrook that the Norwegians' burrow was the only warm place for miles, and families began arriving at the Lindqvist homestead with whatever they could carry: the old, the young, the sick, the desperate. Torsten and Astrid welcomed them all. The house was not large, perhaps 400 square feet of interior space, but it was warm, and warm space can hold more people than comfortable space. They packed 31 people into that buried home over the following days. 31 souls who would have frozen in their wooden houses, who had mocked the badger and his burrow for 3 years, who now pressed together in the warmth that the earth provided, while their civilized houses stood empty and cold half a mile away. The logistics were challenging, but not impossible. Torsten cut new ventilation holes through the sod roof to handle the additional respiration. Astrid organized cooking and sleeping schedules that rotated people through the available space. The stone fireplace, designed to heat a single family, was fired more frequently, but still consumed far less fuel than a wooden house would have required, because the earth was doing most of the work. The temperature dropped to 50 degrees during the crowded period, then rose back to 52, as the additional body heat from 31 people offset the increased ventilation. The stay lasted 11 days. 11 days during which Torsten's buried house sheltered every person who reached it, during which no one froze, during which the earth that everyone had said was fit only for badgers proved to be the only thing capable of keeping humans alive. When the cold finally broke on January 26th, rising to a merely brutal 10 below zero, the survivors emerged blinking into a world that had changed. The wooden houses of Milbrook stood intact but empty, their interiors frozen, their contents ruined by the moisture of repeated freeze-thaw cycles. The families that had survived would need to rebuild, would need to repair, would need to reconsider everything they had assumed about how to build on the prairie. But they were alive to do it, because a Norwegian immigrant had ignored their mockery and built a house that worked. The reckoning came in February, after the survivors had returned to their repaired houses and the count of the dead had been completed. 9 people frozen in structures that had been designed for aesthetics rather than survival. 9 graves that would be dug when the ground thawed. 9 families mourning losses that should not have happened. 9 lives taken by the assumption that looking civilized mattered more than being warm. The gathering was held in Torsten's house because it was the only place large enough and warm enough to hold the survivors comfortably. They came to acknowledge what had happened, to to mourn the dead, and to confront the man who had saved them. Harlan Jessup spoke first. He had recovered physically from his hypothermia, but something in him had broken, some certainty about his own judgment that had sustained him through decades of business and life. 3 years ago, he said, his voice barely audible, I stood in my store and told everyone who would listen that Torsten Lindqvist was building a badger hole. I said no civilized person would live in a structure dug into the ground. I said American houses were proper and the Norwegian way was primitive. I said those things because I sold lumber and I wanted you to buy it, and because I believed them, and because believing them made me feel superior to a man who knew more than I did about how to survive. He stopped, tears running down his face. My wife and I would be dead if Torsten had listened to me. Every person in this room would be dead or dying. I was wrong. I was not just mistaken. I was dangerously wrong. And people died because I convinced them that proper houses mattered more than warm houses. I do not know how to apologize for that. I do not know how to make it right. I only know that I will never again mock a building method simply because it looks strange to me or because I cannot profit from it. Others spoke, the families whose children had survived, the elderly who had found warmth when their own houses failed, the young men who had carried neighbors through the snow to the only refuge available. Each confession added to the weight of what had happened, the accumulated error of a community that had valued appearance over function and paid for that error with lives. When the testimonies were complete, Torsten rose and walked to the center of the room. He was uncomfortable with attention, a man who preferred to let his work speak rather than his words, but he understood that some things needed to be said. In Norway, he began, my people have built this way for longer than anyone remembers. We call them earth houses, and they are not a sign of poverty. They are a sign of understanding. The earth is constant. It does not care whether the air above is summer or winter. 6 feet down, the temperature is always the same, and that temperature is warm enough to live in without freezing and cool enough to live in without overheating. A house built into the earth shares this gift. He looked around at the faces of those who had mocked him. Your houses fight the cold. They present flat walls to the wind and lose heat through every surface. They sit on raised foundations that create cold spaces beneath them. They have thin walls that conduct heat outward as fast as your stoves can produce it. They are beautiful to look at, and they are terrible at keeping you alive. He paused. My house does not fight the cold. It hides from it. 3 walls are buried in earth that is 55 degrees. The roof is buried in earth that is 55 degrees. The only wall that faces the outside is the south wall, which catches the winter sun and loses less heat because it is 1 wall instead of 4. The floor is in contact with the earth, not suspended above a cold crawl space. Everything about the design is aimed at one purpose, keeping the warmth in and the cold out. He looked at Harlan Jessup. You called it a burrow. You were right. Badgers survive the winter by burrowing into the earth. Bears survive by finding caves. Every animal that lives through cold winters does so by getting below the frost line and using the earth's warmth as protection. Only humans try to survive by building towers above the ground and fighting the cold with fire. Sometimes that works. This winter, it did not work. Torsten looked around the room one more time. I will teach anyone who wants to learn how to build this way. The techniques are not difficult. The materials are available everywhere. Earth, stone, timber for the front wall and the roof, and the willingness to work with the land instead of against it. Next winter, every family in Milbrook should have an earth-sheltered room at minimum, a place to shelter when the cold exceeds what your wooden houses can handle. If you build nothing else, build that. It could save your life. The construction began that spring. Torsten supervised the building of 14 earth-sheltered structures across the Milbrook area over the summer of 1887. Some were complete houses like his own. Others were emergency shelters attached to existing wooden houses, semi-buried rooms that families could retreat to when the cold became extreme. All of them followed the same principles. Excavate into a south-facing slope. Line the back and sides with stone. Build only the front wall of timber. Cover the roof with sod and earth until it blends into the hillside above. Create a thermal envelope that the cold cannot penetrate. The results were immediately apparent the following winter. The families with earth-sheltered structures used approximately 1/3 the fuel that families in wooden houses consumed. They maintained temperatures of 50 to 55 degrees with small fires that their neighbors would have considered inadequate. They survived cold snaps that sent wooden house families scrambling for extra fuel or emergency shelter. Harlan Jessup closed his lumber business within 2 years. The demand for building lumber had collapsed as families switched to earth-sheltered construction, and the demand for coal had dropped by more than half. He became a furniture maker instead, a trade that did not depend on convincing people to build wrong. His son Thomas became one of the most skilled earth shelter builders in the territory, learning the techniques from Torsten and adapting them to conditions across the northern plains. The phrase "building Norwegian" entered the vocabulary of the Dakota frontier and spread across the northern territories. It meant constructing with the land rather than on it, using earth as insulation rather than fighting cold with fuel, accepting that traditional techniques sometimes knew things that modern methods had forgotten. It was spoken with respect, as if the speaker understood something about survival that could only be learned through nearly dying of cold in a proper American house. Torsten Lindqvist lived in his earth-sheltered home for another 42 years, passing in the spring of 1929 at the age of 76. Astrid followed him 2 years later, having never spent a cold night in a wooden house after her immigration to America. Their daughter Ingrid inherited the homestead and raised her own family in the same buried rooms that had sheltered 31 people during the worst winter in Dakota history. The house still stands. The earth that covers it has grown thick with prairie grass, and the only signs of human habitation are the door, the windows, and the chimney that rises from what appears to be a natural hillside. The stone walls that Torsten laid in 1883 have not shifted. The timber beams that support the roof have not rotted because the constant temperature and humidity of the earth-sheltered environment prevent the conditions that cause decay. The temperature inside, measured by visitors who come to see this monument to frontier survival, is 54 degrees. The same temperature it was in January of 1887. The same temperature it was the day Torsten finished construction. The same temperature it will be when the people reading this are dead and their grandchildren have grandchildren of their own. Because the earth does not care about calendars. The earth does not care about weather. The earth maintains its temperature with the patience of geology. And a house built into the earth shares that patience for as long as the house exists. Above the door, carved in letters that Torsten added in the years after the Great Cold, is an inscription in both Norwegian and English. Jordan Holder Varman. The earth holds warmth. The settlers who had laughed at his burrow, who had nearly died in their proper houses, who had crawled to his door begging for shelter, they understood exactly what those words meant. And if you learn something from this story about thermal mass and earth-sheltered construction, and the physics that kept one family warm while their neighbors froze, subscribe to this channel, because we have more stories about the forgotten engineering that kept people alive before modern technology made everyone forget how to survive without it. The Earth is still 55 degrees. The knowledge is still there. The only question is whether we are humble enough to use it